Now, one of the most incredible disaster stories
Yep.
and tragedy stories of all time would have to be the plagues that struck the ancient Egyptians.
Yep.
There was death, there was destruction, and yet God rescued them.
Yeah.
I've got friends and they say, hey, James, come on, how can you believe those old stories? Are they really true?
Yeah.
I'd like to take you back to the land of Egypt. Now, Marie, if you were to climb Mount Sinai, it's the most wonderful experience because the people, the ancient Israelis, they were there in Egypt, and the ancient Israelis, they were slaves, basically, just like the slavery of 200 years ago in the United States. And the slave masters, the Egyptians, they treated them very, very harshly. Life looked grim, it was terrible, it was bad, and through the badness and the disaster, God rescued his people. Now, it wasn't all plain sailing. In fact, they had hard work. They climbed to the top or around about Mount Sinai. They travelled through the desert. God didn't stop the hardships. He didn't stop the pain. It took him a couple of hundred years to stop the slavery. But through everything in the Old Testament story we find, God was with his people as they went through the Old Testament wilderness. Now, the question people ask me is, James, how can you possibly say that those old Bible stories are really true? Aren't they just myths and legends? Not at all. Archaeologist David Downs from Australia has travelled the lands of the Middle East, and he believes that the hieroglyphs and the inscriptions on the walls of ancient Egypt tell us the same stories as the Bible. You see, in the 12th dynasty, 1200 years before Christ roughly, in the mines of the Sinai Desert, there were Hebrew or Semitic slaves, and they're carving Al, the ox head A, the hitting stick, the letter L. Al means the Hebrew name for God. And they're saying, God, get me out of here, rescue me, take me away from this disaster. In the same time period of the 12th dynasty, there the Israelites are living in slave towns and they're helping the Egyptians build the mud brick pyramids. Just like the Bible story records, Pharaoh enslaved the Israelis and made them build their mud brick pyramids. Well, the princesses of the time would wear these amulets around their necks, showing the Egyptian taskmasters thumping the daylights out of the Hebrew slaves. You saw that in the bottom. What were these slave people looking like? Well, the Semitic people who lived in Egypt at that time wore these kinds of clothes, coats of various stripes and colours like the Bible records about the story of Joseph. In these tiny little boxes were buried baby boys in the slave quarters of the pyramid builders' towns. Just so sad, just like the Bible story records how that Pharaoh in ancient times would kill the baby boys, trying to prevent the Hebrew population from growing too large. It was a hard time. They were distressing times. It was a dark time. And yet God was there with his people through their dark time. And then came an amazing moment of intervention. God rescued his people in a mighty, mighty act. You see, it was on Mount Sinai that God spoke to Moses the second great law. This law is for human happiness. God said, don't make for yourself any statues for the purpose of bowing down and worshipping them. Why? Statues are useless. They're stone. They're dead. God is a living God. You might as well be praying to a dead cat as praying to a dead statue. God said instead, use your brains and communicate with the God of the universe. He spoke to Moses and said, when you kneel down and pray, don't bow down to a rock. Instead, talk to the God of heaven. And that indeed is the secret of powerful prayer.